What happens when a simple weekend getaway turns into a chaotic Airbnb takeover, forcing me to confront the iron grip of the HOA and discover the power of rebellion in the most unexpected way? Hey there, Porch Patrol Squad. Let me know if you've ever locked horns with a Karen like in today's story. Smash that like button and spill the tea in the comments. And if you're craving more outrageous HOA battles, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Believe me, you don't want to miss how this unfolds. The evening air was thick with enchantment, punctuated only by the scattered giggles and the clattering of shoes on the barn's old wooden floor. I had never considered myself the instigator of a revolution, yet here I was, draped with makeshift garlands of straw, radiating queenly vibes in my own little kingdom. With each step Maya took, a whirl of oversized chic, my heart raced at the prospect of watching Harold's carefully constructed facade of order dissolve into the night like the evaporating remnants of a failed souffle. And what a jocular spectacle it was. If an HOA president could be reduced to a boiling kettle of dismay amidst my eclectic air of joyful rebellion, then everything else in this tiny universe was possible. Look at us. Who knew barn fashion could be such a hit? Maya called out, hands raised as she encouraged everyone to join the parade across the hay-strewn catwalk. It was a question charged with irony because, quite frankly, no one in this neighborhood ever imagined a community gathering could veer so wildly off script. The guests twirled, leaped, and posed in ragged but vibrant ensembles, looking for all the world like they belonged in a rural version of a fashion week. It was intoxicating to watch. I did my best to channel my inner fairy godmother, waving my hands in exasperated gestures, while also pretending I wasn't entirely envious of their carefree abandon. But in that carnival of chaos, one undeniable truth lurked just beneath the surface. Harold was slowly backing away, arm crossed tightly against the clipboard, clinging to his chest like a shield. Each step he took felt like watching a quiet admission of defeat, a soft gulp in the face of overwhelming collective joy. It seemed that with every unexpected turn of events, he became less of a formidable foe and more a protagonist in a comedic tragedy, an HOA leader brought low by his own regulations in a barn bursting with misfits. I shot a glance at Karen, who was scrunching her face in disgust, while subtly gripping the embroidered corners of her pristine tablecloth for dear life. "Harold, didn't you say these folks were ruining your precious community?" I said, intentionally loud enough for everyone to hear, my tone dripping with faux innocence as I put my hands on my hips. Because if I recall correctly, I see a lot more smiles around here than frowns, don't you think? The murmurs from my guests rose into a chorus of agreement, their exuberance a tidal wave that swept through the barn, drowning any lingering objection. It was beautiful, the way my community turned from reluctant onlookers to spirited allies overnight. The laughter was an anathema to Harold's doctrine, scattering his beliefs like autumn leaves on a windy day. As I continued to rally the crowd, I realized the absurdity of the moment. Who could resist the unrelenting charm of haversack models strutting about with bullhorns made of hay? My bravado reached a new pitch as I waved a pair of knockoff aviators, claiming my role as the honorary manager of this whimsical turn of events. And now, I declare the ultimate contest, Best Supporting Role in a Hayloft. The air crackled with anticipation as guests erupted in cheers. Harold's eyes flickered back and forth as if trying to calculate the trajectory of his already shaky authority. "You all have 1 minute to impress me." And just like that, my barn transformed into a stage, each participant emboldened with the spirit of spontaneity. When the timer buzzed, the barn erupted. Debates about who wore the funniest getup turned into raucous contests that contained too much laughter for me to capture in words. It was as if a night of unrestrained creativity had broken free under the relentless watch of the disheveled HOA president. But where was the glorious irony, you ask? Oh, it came when Karen, desperate to regain a fraction of the spotlight, attempted to regain control by shouting over my infernal cackling crowd, "This is all against the rules. We must maintain some dignity." To which Maya, donning a mismatched bouquet of clashing textiles, shot back, "Dignity? That sounds like something we left outside with the hay bales." Suddenly, I saw the opportunity for one final dramatic approach to this delightfully ludicrous night. "Attention, everyone!" I mimicked a sportscaster, straining to keep my balance on a stool left unceremoniously near the makeshift runway. Upon getting their attention, I locked eyes with Harold, a sparkle of triumph igniting my gaze. For the conclusion of our fantastic festivities, and to honor our special guests, I announce we will be crowning a newly formed royalty. My heart thudded excitement. This was my chance to turn the tide. And who better to represent our newfound grassroots joy than our very own Karen? The audible gasps echoed like music, intertwining with the laughter that buzzed around the barn. Harold's face morphed into a mask of profound dismay. I could hardly believe the sudden turn of events unleashed a collective hilarity, mighty enough to shatter HOA barriers built through years of rigid governance. Karen's face paled, then reddened, as the crowd turned toward her, their laughter sweet but tinged with freedom's edge. The very embodiment of my foe, stripped of her moral high ground, became a heroic figure in her own tragicomedy, a true diva thrown into the messy yet delightful ring, and I could see the dawning realization that this little rebellion had turned the neighborhood's tide. As they crowned Karen with a garland crafted from old flower pots and dandelions, I reveled in the spirit of whimsical pride that exploded inside the barn. Watching my community transform from fearful constituents to boisterous allies was like witnessing the transformative power of laughter become a balm for all our grievances. There was beauty in the absurdity of it, of both Harold and Karen finding themselves drawn into the raucous celebration rather than the rigid pages of the HOA playbook. However outlandish it felt amidst the mad whirl of revolution, I realized I was leading a joyous rebellion, refusing to let Harold grasp control again. What could possibly happen next? Would their laughter inspire a new genesis of harmony? Or would Harold retreat to his clipboard fortress, waiting for the next rebuke? Beneath the cacophony of laughter and clinking glasses, a change had taken root in our tight-knit community, and I felt its warmth spreading like wildfire around the barn. The spirit of unity enveloped us in a hazy haze of euphoric rebellion against the authoritarian gloom heralded by the HOA. As Harold awkwardly tried to reassert his dominance, flipping through rulebooks that had become artifacts of what felt like a forgotten world, my guests unleashed their creativity onto the barn's wooden floors. Each laugh felt like sabotage against his heavily guarded image of order, as though we were all participants in an elaborate heist that sought to steal a moment of wildness in the mundane. Harold, standing there with a clipboard in one hand and an expression of utter disbelief on his face, looked every bit like a mannequin that had come to life after being left unattended for too long. Yet, just as I began to revel in our collective defiance, a pair of stern voices broke through the jubilant clutter. A couple of ladies from the HOA board decided to make an untriumphant entrance. Clad in pastel power suits and clutching their designer handbags, their expressions were set to appalled, complete with dramatic gasps echoing through the barn as they laid eyes on what was unfolding. "What is happening here?" One of them, a sharp-nosed woman named Linda, exclaimed, clutching the collar of her pearls as if they might shield her from the unruly chaos. I couldn't help but chuckle inwardly. She was about to discover that the barn had morphed into a stage for my own version of the Real Housewives of Hillside Acres. As the board members surveyed the sight before them, Karen, in her garland of flower pots, wearing an expression that teetered between horror and reluctant acceptance. Maya taking selfies, as if posing for a magazine spread. And my other guests engaged in lively debates about whose hay bale model perfectly encapsulated farm chic. My heart swelled with a sense of mischief. Sensing their mounting irritation, I decided to seize this golden opportunity. "Oh, ladies, you simply must join us. Tonight, the HOA has finally been transformed. The community is embracing its wild side. Would you care to take part in our best supporting role in a Hayloft competition?" I thrust my hands towards them in an exaggerated gesture, my voice bubbling with feigned enthusiasm. The collective gasp in response could have generated enough wind to topple a stack of hay bales. Of course, the sheer thought of my neighbors, who had scorned spontaneity for years, blending into the unrefined hilarity, was breathtakingly absurd. I could see Linda's thoughts racing behind her chipper facade, calculating the probability of her maintaining her pristine reputation while confronting an avalanche of rustic debauchery. But before I could wallow in their conflicted expressions for too long, a daring voice pierced through the air. "I'll do it," Maya exclaimed, exuberance radiating from her as she twirled in her oversized sweater. "Come on, Linda. You can't leave a young lady hanging, right?" Faced with this challenge, Linda's expression transformed from disbelief to scrutiny. The rise and fall of her arched eyebrows told a tale. I could almost hear her internal debate on whether emerging as an unexpected star might save her public image. Moments later, much to my utter delight, Linda was reluctantly swept into the fray. With radiant stubbornness, the board members flanked her, unwilling to let their queen of entitlement face the stage alone. What unfolded was nothing short of a Renaissance fair gone wrong, as Linda stumbled into an impromptu toast while propped atop a hay bale. Her ring-laden fingers clutched a mason jar filled with iced tea in what was meant to be a toast to community values. But she ended up sounding more like she was auditioning for a sitcom. May we never forget the importance of fencing. "And you, young lady," she pointed at Maya, "your shoes are utterly gnarled. This is not how dignified women dress." Laughter erupted. It was a Gordon Ramsay-worthy roast, delivered with the flair of an actress far past her prime. As the barn erupted into chaos, I felt the wind of transformation blowing gently against my skin. Harold had basically disintegrated into a mere prop in this newfound hilarity. There he stood, clipboard swinging in hopeless disarray, the embodiment of a community leader caught unaware by the delightful rebellion that unfurled around him. The stark difference between his once imposing presence and the abject hilarity of the event struck me like a bolt of lightning. He was no longer a voice of authority, but merely a defeated relic in the face of collective joy. The board members flailing about, governed by social cues not built on rigid rites but pure, uncomplicated laughter, was a sight I'd cherish forever. By the time Karen had dipped her polished toes into the proverbial pool of chaos, I was certain she'd be claiming her own best supporting role in a matter of moments. Quite drenched in irony, she was very much at the heart of our humorous revolution, trying to shoo away an enthusiastic cowbell, courtesy of yours truly, that was now being utilized as a hilarious prop for announcing "hay penning" moments. I chuckled at how the evening had yielded a beautiful melodrama, propelling all of us together in a moment of frivolity that would surely live on in the memories of those present. As the music faded into a captivating silence and the last rays of sun disappeared behind the horizon, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I'd turned my barn from an HOA target into a sanctuary for diversity, creativity, and joy. The laughter, camaraderie, and unexpected anarchy had snatched back the narrative from the claws of entitlement, serving as a delightful reminder of what truly connects us as neighbors. Resilience wrapped in hilarity. A grand bonfire warmed the cool night air as I invited my guests to embrace the fire's glow, and in that moment I glanced at Harold, whose expression was still frozen mid-panic. "Looks like you've got a whole village of unruly guests, Harold." I chuckled, watching as he resignedly shifted in his stance, finally acknowledging that perhaps, just perhaps, the bonds of community are stronger than the rules we impose. As the merriment continued, I found myself reveling in the glorious absurdity that had unfolded. Was this new epoch of community here to stay? Only time would tell, but for now, I reveled in the sweet taste of victory. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my beat-up pickup, the vision of a serene family getaway danced through my mind like the sun cascading over the horizon. I could almost hear the echoes of my mother's laughter, mixed with the sound of crickets chirping under a starlit sky. It was bliss, a juxtaposition to my recent chaos of HOA meetings and their endless inspections of my neighborhood standards. Just as I thought I was free for the weekend, a frantic knock interrupted my daydream. There stood Karen, the HOA president, glaring at me with the intensity of a hawk eyeing its prey. Dressed as if she had just walked out of a 1950s cleanser ad, clipboard in hand, she was every bit the embodiment of suburban tyranny, in crisp slate gray slacks and a button blouse so stiff it could stand up by itself. "Jordan, we must talk," she barked, her voice higher than the volume I usually reserved for calling my dog inside for dinner. She ignored everything from the Sunset Depot of a beautiful Saturday morning to the half-packed suitcase sitting on my porch and launched straight into what could only be described as an HOA marketing pitch for converting my barn into an HOA. Airbnb. Think of it as community improvement. The neighborhood needs a fresh look and a charming temporary rental license. Will do just the trick, she cooed, as if I was her personal sales project. I stared at her incredulously, trying to process what was happening. Part of me felt like I had just stepped into a bad sitcom, while another part screamed indignantly at her audacity. I was simply trying to enjoy a weekend away, and now I was supposed to consider turning my beloved barn into a revolving door of tourists. Despite my growing exasperation, I found myself half-heartedly agreeing to think about it, picturing a parade of strangers traipsing through my space like a herd of cattle at a country fair. The idea was ridiculous. I could already hear Harold, my overly meticulous neighbor, strutting about the neighborhood like a self-appointed general of the HOA, dictating rules as if he had a copy of them tattooed on his forearm. Gritting my teeth, I waved Karen off with an exaggerated smile that was more of a grimace, the kind which could only be described as polite hostility. With that, I finally dove into my truck, sputtering with indignation, and headed out, leaving my chaotic barn, not to mention the very idea of Airbnb behind. By the time I returned from my family visit, I craved solace and perhaps a good cup of coffee. However, fate had different plans for me. As I pulled into my driveway, my joints froze with horror. My barn had transformed into a bustling summer camp for millennials. There were yoga mats spread across the yard, exotic outdoor furniture arranged with an air of whimsical absurdity, and a small bonfire pit surrounded by a gaggle of eclectic 20-somethings. I thought I had accidentally stumbled onto a community festival. Suddenly, my serene retreat felt like the set of a reality show, with cameras and hashtags and way too many flowering plants. Barn life was splashed across the internet, and I felt my eyelids twitch under the pressure of brewing chaos. Defeated, I tried to plow through the disheveled group towards the barn's entry, when I spotted Maya, the vibrant purple-haired digital nomad, who had just thrust a smartphone in my face with her signature exuberance. "Say cheese, Jordan. You're going to be a part of our social media story. This place is amazing," she gushed, inadvertently causing my blood pressure to spiral. The irony of being an unwilling influencer was not lost on me. "Right, I'll just take a moment to turn my hayloft into a picture-perfect paradise," I muttered sarcastically, trying to suppress the rolling tide of annoyance that wanted to burst forth and start a verbal firestorm of complaint. Yet, as I stood there witnessing utter chaos, an idea struck me: why not turn this all on its head? The more I surveyed the circus in my yard, the more my gears began to turn. If the HOA wanted to push me into recognizing my property as a revenue generator, then I would ensure they got a taste of their own medicine. I would host a weekend at Jordan's Barn community event. I could charge rooftop prices for fallen hay and yoga classes, accompanied by cheers from Karen and Harold themselves. I could imagine their faces paling at the sight of their precious HOA rules being turned into such mockery. Maybe, just maybe, I could make this absurdity work to my advantage, turning their grating entitlements into pure comedic gold, all while flouting the very rules they had tried to impose on me. What could possibly go wrong? With newfound resolve, I summoned the courage often reserved for brave explorers headed into uncharted territories, specifically right into the now bustling hayloft. I was determined to turn this chaotic Airbnb takeover into my personal utopia. I cleared my throat dramatically and slipped into my event manager mode, channeling my inner carnival barker. "Welcome, friends, to the first annual weekend at Jordan's Barn," I proclaimed, barely concealing a mischievous grin as the bewildered guests paused their yoga poses. For an exclusive rate, you too can partake in an authentic rural experience. artisanal hay bales, premium vegan snacks sourced from an organic neighborhood farm, my grandma's store actually, and a raucous country karaoke night. The confused look soon shifted to excitement as I saw the wheels turning in their heads, contemplating the possibilities of social posts tagged with Hayloft karaoke. Meanwhile, the thought of Harold and Karen perched at the edge of my property, like hawks on a fence post, filled me with glee. I could just imagine Harold's meticulously maintained facial expression crumbling as he watched the great HOA enforced plans for orderly tranquility dissolve into a ruckus of laughter, campfire songs, and, no doubt, a few horrible renditions of Achy Breaky Heart. I rallied the guests to embrace this delightful absurdity, showing them how to turn the yoga mats into bonfire circles, utilizing the colorful throws from the irony-infused outdoor furniture for extra flair. Come on, nothing says relaxation like splinters and burnt s'mores, am I right? I quipped, clapping my hands together for effect, igniting their enthusiasm. As the day segued into a blissfully chaotic night, the laughter grew louder, twinkling lights began to sparkle, and someone had indeed pulled out a guitar, strumming in earnest, but completely off-key, attempt at Americana. It was beautifully ridiculous, and just the way I liked it, with reckless abandon. Maya, seeing my faux cowboy fashion emergence, chimed in excitedly. You should totally take a video for TikTok. You could go viral. I tilted my head in response, allowing a volley of laughter to erupt from my dog Jasper, who had been romping alongside the now uncensored guests. Who knew that a farm setting with multiple influencers could double as a launchpad for my own online fame? Deep down, part of me reveled in the thought of users flocking to their feeds, asking, "Who is this fierce barn queen?" By the time morning rolled around, it was an anarchic breakfast spread. Organic granola clashed with store-bought donuts, kombucha fizz next to lukewarm coffee. The spirit of rebellion against the HOA's strict guidelines was palpable in the air, not to mention the unmistakable scent of barista-level mocktails mixing awkwardly with farm aromas. I'd effectively transformed my property from a sleepy farmland into what could only be described as the hipster Epcot of Airbnb experiences. Who knew that turning my quaint hayloft into a gathering space would yield such camaraderie? I even managed to convert a skeptical guest into an enthusiastic farmhand when a politeness-laden debate on veganism spiraled into a pretty intense debate about cow massage therapy, which I somehow found mildly entertaining. Meanwhile, out of the corner of my eye, I spied Harold lurking behind the potted succulents. He was practically begging for a pet crisis. His trademark khakis were utterly out of place among the vibrant, eclectic colors that had now taken over my property. I could almost see steam billowing from his ears at the audacity of it all, which only made me smile wider. Here was a man who thrived on control, and yet here I was orchestrating wild shenanigans on what he deemed my taxpayer-funded rural estate. Was this not the most delicious form of karma? As I surveyed my domain filled with laughing guests in the spirit of pure rebellion, I realized my farmlands had never looked more alive, and Harold and Karen were about to burst from their tightly wound shells. I half wished they would drop by with their own poor attempts at friendliness. Everything was so much better shared after all. Just then, a whirlwind of lavender and oversized acceptance t-shirts swept past me, Maya now announcing, "Group selfie, everyone." Naturally, I obliged, draping my arm around her while the motley crew gathered around. The idea of squishing my mom's vintage quilt into this social media frenzy was almost too fitting to resist. As I raised my phone to snap the moment, I couldn't help but think how absolutely absurdly blissful the chaos of this Airbnb takeover had become. When a neighbor's phone rang with a distressed voicemail from Harold's wife about garden regulations, I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA was forced to acknowledge the inevitable trend crashing upon their neatly manicured lawns. A rush of determination engulfed me as I foresaw the moment Harold realized that his precious HOA bylaws had become relics, drowned out by the absurd merriment of a barn now buzzing with life. My fingers, poised over the screen for the perfect shot, lingered in anticipation for the arrival of the regulation police. Who would have thought that an impulsive decision to transform my hayloft into a spirited hub could erupt into such glorious retribution? I couldn't help but chortle at the forthcoming spectacle of Harold feebly attempting to reclaim his order among my raucous retreat. Well, this was going to be quite the showdown. How would the HOA cope with their downsized reputation now? All I knew was that I was ready for whatever came next. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across my property, I savored the sweet taste of chaos blooming with every laugh that echoed off the old barn walls. The scent of burnt marshmallows, mixed with whimsical fairy lights strung along my barn, had morphed this once solemn space into a lively celebration of freedom. This new chapter was powered by the serendipitous union of influencers, yoga enthusiasts, and my budding spirit of rebellion. However, all this joy felt like an audacious challenge thrown straight at Harold's meticulously constructed, pristine world. Who knew that mediocre farm life could spark such a raucous upheaval? I surely didn't. But there I was, standing at the epicenter of absolute hilarity while Harold's aura of judgment lingered just beyond the chaos. Peering into the chaos of laughter and slightly off-key revelry, I spotted Harold's towering silhouette lurking by the ancient oak. I could practically hear his brain whirring as he concocted plot lines to reclaim control over this barnyard bonanza. The way he adjusted his glasses and practically starred a hole into the group sprawled on the lawn made it clear he was secretly plotting a coup. But to me, it spoke volumes. Here was the man who spent nearly a decade dictating the color of our mailbox and the length of our grass blades, now tormented by the very freedom he had so feared. Well, Harold, I thought, biting back a snicker, what's it like to have your own rules thrown back in your face? A taste of your own HOA medicine. Just then, an innocent spark lit within me. It was the perfect time to escalate this comedic battle. Chuckling softly to myself, I decided to throw in a spontaneous BBQ special, dressed up as an HOA infraction parade. Leave it to me, I mumbled, rushing to the barn for coals and skewers. Half an hour later, the guests clutched sizzling skewers, dancing in a zigzag like a joyful conga line as I orchestrated a musical number about how the HOA had officially gone haywire. In scenes reminiscent of the most vibrant old country musicals, my guests began belting out their own verses, an ode to the absurdity of the HOA regulations they were, unknowingly, vowing to break with every delicious bite of charred goodness. Amidst the swirling winds of spontaneity, I took a moment to glance sideways at the stoic Harold, now clad in a look of utter heartbreak, a look that screamed, "My God, what have I started?" I savored this newfound triumph while he attempted to summon the courage for an intervention. Every smile and joyous shout from my guests felt like an echo undeserving of his tight-fisted grip on order. If only he could embrace the messy beauty of life as I had. But oh no! Instead, he stood resolutely with his arms crossed, as if that alone would restore the majesty of his reign. Little did he know that my loyal band of joyful rebels was already planning their next whimsical move, envisioning a barn fashion show to flaunt their creativity while mocking every guideline he'd enforced. As the night deepened, I couldn't believe how quickly my plans were manifesting into a series of delightful spectacles. The air, once thick with tension, transformed into an exhilarating whirlwind of laughter and bonding. We had become a sovereign nation of wayward misfits, and the only entry requirement was a willingness to partake in the fun. Just when I thought it couldn't get any better, Maya, in a burst of delight, grabbed my arm and declared, "We should totally crown you the queen of the hayloft." My heart sang at the thought, diving even deeper into the merriment surrounding us. How marvelous it felt to morph something meant for the scrutiny of an oblivious authority into an outright carnival of chaos, celebrating life on our own terms. While I was busy weaving in and out of this fabric of intrigue and excitement, I suddenly noticed Karen's stout figure approaching. Her signature, "We must talk," face plastered onto her expression. Like a piece of thoroughbred machinery, she charged through the chaos. She promptly yanked me aside and hissed through clenched teeth, "What do you think you're doing?" This isn't how this community is supposed to operate. Lost in the absurd spectacle surrounding me, it was difficult to take her seriously. How could she not recognize the beauty in laughter and the power of camaraderie? Perhaps her vacuum of order needed a taste of raucous freedom. With a mix of sass and humor, I met her indignation with a smile. "Oh, you're absolutely right. We were discussing the HOA's latest guidelines on how to have a fun barn party. What do you think about mandatory karaoke requirements?" My words dripped with sarcasm as I delightedly watched her face flamboyantly twitch. The battle lines were drawn, and Karen's eyes flared in horror at the prospect of singing alongside strangers. I turned to my guests, rallying them to join me in singing Jolene, as fondly as one might serenade a beloved relative. The laughter from our crowd echoed across the farm, wrapped around my bright ideals of freedom, and spurred me onward in this epic clash of rural willpower. How I longed for the moment when Harold and Karen would truly grasp that this was not the end, but merely the starting whistle for an interlude of absurdly joyful rebellion. The BBQ became the talk of the town, or rather, the talk of the barn, as my gaggle of merry rogue guests transformed into a mini cult of spontaneous revelry. But among the joy, the looming specter of Harold's attempted intervention grew thicker than the smoke swirling in the air. Just when I thought I had him appropriately frazzled, a new, slightly chaotic turn of events unfurled. It began when Maya decided to venture into the barn loft and emerged prominently wearing a grandma sweater, strategically borrowed from my collection of vintage attire, and a crown made from cow parsley. "Behold, the queen of the Hayloft's emissary," she announced, arms wide, her proclamation leaking more humor than authority. The guests erupted into fits of laughter, and I half wanted to grab my knitting needles and join the ensemble of misfits, but I kept my regal composure. At least, I tried to. As if summoned by the ultimate ruckus, Harold stalked over, his khakis starched to military precision, a white-knuckled grip on his clipboard, so he could keep track of every single infraction. Bless his heart, that clipboard was like a magician pulling out a seemingly endless array of rabbits, each miscalculation multiplying in absurdity. This is unacceptable. You think you can just flaunt my rules?" His voice, a tenor straining against bass, ripped through the air like a dissonant note. "You can't just invite a whole herd of soul-searching dropouts to parade around like this. It's chaos." For a moment, I had to suppress a giggle. In his attempt to chastise me, he looked less like a commanding HOA president and more like an out-of-place scarecrow at a glitter confetti party. I feigned shock while nuzzling the crown upon my head, preparing my thespian skills for the showdown of our lives. "Harold, dear," I chirped, dripping with saccharine sarcasm, "you should come join us. Surely there's a dance move hiding inside you somewhere." A wave of laughter rippled through the barn, amplifying the level of absurdity soaring like hot air balloons. But Harold stood firmly, muddying the spirit of merriment with his frosty demeanor, as confused as an owl at a rave. I realized that his pitiful moral authority couldn't extinguish the frolicking fires of rebellion I had kindled. A brazen resolve filled my heart. No longer would Harold dictate how I could celebrate my land and life. But alas, Karen had not yet left the stage, and she seized the moment like an actress posing for an Oscar. "This is not how community is defined," she thundered, her eyes narrowing in almost precognitive anger. She would absolutely not go quietly into the good night. These guests are a bad influence. What will happen to our precious countryside if we allow this madness to continue? I blinked as her rant unfurled, a brilliantly dramatic speech, ripe with the usual HOA melodrama. Oh, the sheer audacity. It's not as if her vision of a precious countryside included a community so stifling it could smother a sunflower. My guests were not villains from a horror film. They were an eclectic bunch embracing joy, or, as I like to put it, garden variety chaos. Approaching the crescendo in my attempt at rebellion, I exchanged glances with Maya, who prepared for our next spectacle, as she accidentally spilled her punch all over the meticulously manicured symptoms of Harold's revitalized lawn. "Oops, sorry about that," She grinned devilishly, a choreographed risk that sent Harold conspicuously tiptoeing forward in a panic. Suddenly, with my royal glee, I slapped my hands together, announcing, "Time for our barn fashion show." In an impressive synchronicity propelled by unwritten group dynamics, my guests grabbed bits and pieces of hay-strewn fashion from the tack room, overalls as casual gowns, flannel as trendy jackets, and enough yarn to knit a kaleidoscope of mischief. "Strut your stuff, folks! Show the HOA what real individuality looks like." An amused euphoria filled the air, and Harold's perplexed stare morphed into a mixture of disbelief and horror as guests paraded around, some hopping on bales of hay while others engaged in twirls that would have gotten them immediately disqualified from any conventional runway. The absurdity hit critical mass as a friendly debate sparked up, not just about fashion choices but existential dilemmas sparked by their spontaneous freedom. In that moment, Harold stood to the side, literally grinding his teeth, casting anger-laden looks at the disgrace unfolding under the beams of my barn. His once unshakable authority crumbled, a rapid unraveling of a fort he'd spent years fortifying, and oh, how satisfying it was. As the grand finale approached, guests lined up for one last hurrah, posing for selfies with handcrafted signs declaring, "Freedom is fashion," and Harold who? It hit me, the perfect karma. The irony that, through their lighthearted chain of rambunctious rebellion, they had twisted the narrative back against him, transforming him from an iron-fisted HOA enforcer into the punchline of our rural joke, giving him a grandly mocking bow as if he was the unwilling king in our royal jest. I felt elated. The moment of realization would soon reset our neighborhood dynamics, heralding a brighter era of quirky creativity breaking free from the Tyra HOA rulebook. And concurrently there stood Harold, flabbergasted by how merriment had toppled over his austere ideals, one laugh at a time. At last, the laughter echoed through the barn, spilling out into the moonlit night. In that euphoric frenzy, perhaps a hint of companionship would sprout from the wreckage of his carefully curated world. One could only dream, or at the very least imagine what could happen next. After all, how might an unstoppable force like merry-hearted revolt fare against Harold's staunch determination? Would he embrace the hilarity, or might humor just corrode the foundations he once held so dear? Thanks for tuning in. It really means a lot to us. If you're still fired up from this HOA showdown, check out our next jaw-dropping battle on the right, or let YouTube surprise you with another wild ride on the left. Take your pick, and I'll see you in the next neighborhood drama.